He thought it was just another cold night, just dinner, just silence, just the same ache that never quite left. But when he opened the door to a stranger in the snow, a woman with eyes full of storms and a child in her arms, everything changed. If you believe in second chances, quiet courage, and the kind of love that doesn't need words, like this video and subscribe to our channel. We tell stories that stay with you, long after the fire burns low. Daniel Hayes hadn't planned on going outside again that night. The fire was already low, the logs stacked neatly near the hearth. His son, Jack, had fallen asleep on the worn couch with a book resting on his chest, the same book they'd read every night since the snow came early that year. Daniel had just pulled the quilt up over the boy's shoulders, checked the latch on the cabin door, and stirred the coals one last time. But then he heard it, faint at first, so soft he thought it might have been the wind shifting through the pines behind the house. But wind didn't cry like that. It didn't carry a sound so human, so raw, that it could freeze a man even in front of a fire. Daniel stood still, the iron poker in his hand, breath held. There it was again, a sound like weeping, ragged, lost. He moved. The coat by the door was already half-buttoned before he realized what he was doing. He grabbed the flashlight and stepped out into the bitter dark, boots crunching through a thin layer of frozen ground. The moon was hidden behind a wall of clouds. The forest loomed like a memory he couldn't quite forget. He followed the sound. It pulled him past the edge of his clearing, past the old cedar stump, and into the narrow trail his wife used to love, back when her laughter still echoed in these trees. The flashlight wavered. His breath caught in his throat, not from the cold this time, but from the sudden stillness. Then he saw her. At the base of a pine, barely upright against the trunk, sat a woman clutching two children to her chest. One child, a toddler, was nestled inside her coat, unmoving. The other, a girl of maybe 5, stared at him with wide, tearless eyes. The woman's face was pale, wind-burned, her lips cracked and trembling. Her coat was expensive, dark wool, satin-lined, but soaked through and torn at the shoulder. Her hands were raw and scraped, still wrapped protectively around the little ones. Daniel dropped to one knee. "You all right?" he asked, gently but loud enough to cut through the wind. The woman blinked at him like it took effort. I didn't mean to trespass," she whispered. "Please, just let them stay warm. Just the kids. I'll keep moving." "The hell you will," Daniel muttered. He didn't ask another question. He peeled the toddler from her grip, lighter than any child that size should be, and nodded for the girl to come. She hesitated only a second before crawling toward him, her fingers clutching the hem of his coat. He led them back through the trees, one arm holding the baby, the other guiding the girl by the shoulder. The woman followed on shaking legs, her breath hitching with every step. Daniel glanced back once to make sure she was still there. She was. Inside the cabin, the air was warm and thick with the scent of cedar and something sweet from earlier, apples and cinnamon. Jack stirred as Daniel laid the toddler on the couch beside him but didn't wake. Daniel turned to the woman, who had collapsed against the wall, sliding slowly to the floor. "Sit," he said softly, nodding toward the armchair. "By the fire." She shook her head. "I can't pay you, I don't even know. I didn't ask for anything." Her eyes flicked up to his, glassy but fierce, gray eyes, almost silver, the kind that had seen too much too soon. He walked to the kitchen, poured a mug of hot water, dropped in a chamomile tea bag, and set it gently on the end table beside her. "Drink." She took it with both hands. They were trembling, not just from cold, he realized, but from exhaustion, and something deeper, something like shame. The toddler stirred, gave a weak cry. Daniel handed the child back to her. She took him with reverence, like holding him was the only thing keeping her upright. "My name's Daniel," he said. "That's my boy, Jack. We live quiet here. You're safe." She nodded once. "Ava," she whispered. "Ava Lane." He didn't flinch at the lie. He'd seen her face before on the cover of magazines, headlines, scandals. Ava Lancaster, heiress, Disappeared billionaire. The youngest CEO in Manhattan before it all came crashing down in courtrooms and gossip columns. He looked at her now, barefoot, hollow-eyed, curled in his old leather chair with a sleeping child in her arms. And all he saw was someone trying to survive. He pulled another blanket from the chest by the fire and draped it over her without a word. She flinched at first, then let it settle. She didn't thank him. She didn't have to. Later, when the flames had softened and the room was quiet again, Daniel sat at the edge of his son's bed, watching the fire dance in the corner of his eye. He'd always thought nothing would surprise him anymore. That grief had carved him out so hollow he'd forgotten what it felt like to be shaken. But something had cracked tonight. Not broken, just shifted. There, in the hush between firelight and snowfall, sat a woman the world had tried to erase. And against his better judgment, Daniel Hayes had let her in. He didn't know her story, but somehow he already knew. This was not the last night she would spend in his cabin, and this was not the end of his silence. Daniel woke early, as he always did before the sun began filtering through the slats of the cabin's shutters. The fire had died sometime during the night, leaving the air cool enough for his breath to hang in a fine mist. He wrapped himself in his wool flannel and made his way to the kitchen, quiet so as not to wake Jack, or the woman. He didn't know what to expect when he turned the corner into the living room, but she was already awake. Ava sat in the same chair she had sunk into the night before, arms folded across her chest like armor. The toddler, barely more than a baby, slept in a bundle of blankets on the couch. The older girl, whose name he still didn't know, had curled up at her mother's feet like a pup beside a fire. Only Ava didn't look at peace. She was staring at the glowing embers, wide-eyed and unmoving. "You sleep at all?" Daniel asked softly, pouring water into the kettle. She didn't answer. He didn't push. Instead, he set about making coffee and warming the skillet. After a while, the scent of frying eggs and butter began to fill the room, mingling with the crackle of firewood he'd just rekindled. Ava turned slightly, her lips parted. "You don't have to feed us." Daniel glanced at her, then at the girl now stirring under the quilt. "They're just kids. Kids eat. That's not charity, it's breakfast." The corner of her mouth almost twitched. Almost. The girl sat up slowly, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She was smaller than Jack, maybe 5, with curls that hung in tangled ringlets over her shoulders. She looked at Ava first, seeking permission, and when her mother gave the faintest nod, she slid off the couch and padded barefoot to the table. Daniel poured her a glass of milk. She took it without a word and drank deeply. "What's her name?" he asked gently. Ava hesitated. "Lily." He nodded. "And the little one?" Ava brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "Caleb." "Good names," Daniel said, turning the eggs. "Strong." Another long silence. Then Ava rose to her feet and began folding the blankets from the couch. Her movements were sharp, precise, not rushed but purposeful, almost rehearsed. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I do." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask. There was something about the way she moved, the way she never let her eyes settle for too long in one place, that told him she didn't trust stillness, didn't believe in safe spaces, not anymore. After breakfast, Jack woke. He rubbed his eyes and stared across the table at the strangers in his home. Then, as if deciding there was nothing to be afraid of, he looked to Daniel. "Are they staying?" "For now," Daniel said. "Okay," Jack replied and went to get his crayons. Ava blinked at that, like she'd expected more questions. Or worse. "He's good with people," Daniel said. "Gets that from his mom." Her expression softened, but only a little. Daniel stood, poured 2 mugs of coffee, and brought one to her. She took it with both hands. Her eyes, those storm-gray eyes, met his. "You knew who I was last night, didn't you?" He didn't flinch. "I had a guess. And yet you let me in anyway." Daniel leaned against the counter. "I didn't see a billionaire. I saw a woman freezing in the woods with 2 kids and no backup. No backup, she whispered. The words seemed to hit her harder than she expected. He let the silence breathe. I ran, she said after a while, her voice low. I had money, protection, all the legal firepower in the world. But when it came down to it, none of that kept us safe. Daniel didn't ask from who. He already knew. The look in her eyes told him enough. She wasn't afraid of the dark. She was afraid of what she'd escaped from. You made it out, he said. For now, he nodded. That's how most of us survive, one day at a time. Later that morning, after Lily and Jack had started drawing on the cabin floor with colored pencils, Daniel stepped outside to chop wood. The air was crisp, the sky a soft pewter. Snow hadn't fallen overnight, but it was coming. He could feel it in his joints, in the old burn scar that still flared when the cold sank too deep. He had just split the third log when he heard her behind him. I can help, Ava said. She was wrapped in a different coat now. One from his closet. Still too big for her, but warmer than the tailored luxury garment she'd arrived in, which now hung drying near the fire. You ever split wood before? He asked, handing her the axe. No. He paused, one brow raised. But I've dismantled corporate boards, she added, deadpan. Daniel chuckled. Close enough. He watched her raise the axe, slightly too stiff at the shoulders, and swing. It was a poor strike. The blade barely lodged in the knot. She let out a breath and looked up. Do people get better at this? They do. When they stop trying to force it. She stared at him for a moment, then gave a small nod and tried. Again, this time slower, more centered. The axe landed true. The log split. A small, quiet smile broke across her lips. And for the first time since she arrived, Daniel saw something flicker in her expression that wasn't fear. It was pride. That night, after the kids had gone to bed and the fire burned low, again Daniel found her still sitting near the window, looking out into the darkness like it might come back for her. You're safe here, he said softly. She turned toward him. I don't think I know what that means anymore. He nodded. Then maybe we'll find out together. Her lips parted, but no sound came. And for a moment, just a moment, Daniel felt something shift in the room. Not love. Not yet. But the absence of fear. And that, he knew, was its own kind of miracle. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Daniel hadn't expected. It wasn't quite peace, more like a quiet truce between past and present. Ava moved through the cabin like someone trying not to leave a footprint, yet her presence lingered in the soft hum of the kettle, the second cup of coffee on the counter, the faint scent of lavender from the scarf she'd begun wearing around her neck. Daniel didn't ask questions, not because he wasn't curious. He was, but because he knew the weight of silence. Sometimes it was the only thing that held a person together. Still, there were things he noticed. Ava kept a small leather notebook tucked into her coat. She never wrote in front of anyone, but he'd catch her fingers lingering on it, like it held more than memories, like it held her resolve. She flinched whenever someone knocked on the door, even if it was only the wind. And once, when Jack accidentally dropped a cup, the crash sent her halfway across the room before she realized it wasn't a threat. She apologized for it later. He told her not to. On the third morning, the snow began to fall in earnest, thick, slow, and quiet like the world exhaling. Jack and Lily built a snow fort just beyond the porch, their laughter sharp against the muffled woods. Daniel stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching as Lily handed Jack a snowball like a soldier passing ammunition. You'd think they'd known each other their whole lives, he murmured. Ava was sitting at the table, tying twine around a bundle of firewood. Kids don't waste time on things like permission, she said. They just decide to trust or they don't. He glanced at her. And you? She didn't look up. I used to be fast like that too, but now I hesitate. Daniel nodded. It's allowed. She set the bundle aside and met his eyes. Is it? That afternoon, the power went out. Not uncommon this far north when snow piled heavy and wet. Daniel moved with practiced ease, lighting candles, stoking the fire higher, laying out thick quilts. He didn't realize until later that evening how close they had all drawn to the hearth, 4 figures in flickering light, the storm howling beyond the walls. The kids had fallen asleep on a blanket spread near the fire. Daniel was setting another log when Ava spoke, her voice low but steady. "Do you want to know why I ran?" He didn't move. "Only if you want to tell me." She was sitting cross-legged, arms around her knees, eyes fixed on the fire. "I was supposed to inherit everything," she said. "Lancaster Holdings, one of the largest private financial firms in the country, built by men who believed nothing was worth doing unless it doubled your power." Daniel stayed quiet. "I tried to change things, tried to build a fund for shelter programs, single mothers, community homes. I'd seen too many women vanish because they couldn't afford to stay." She paused. "That's how I met him." Daniel didn't need to ask who. He said all the right things. Told me he believed in the mission, that he admired my fire. Her voice caught then, not a sob, not a whimper, but a small fracture in her breath. But it was my name he wanted, my stake, my silence. Daniel turned to her, the firelight softening the harsh line of her cheekbone, the stubborn set of her jaw. "When I tried to leave," she said, "he made sure no one would follow me. Froze my accounts, threatened custody. My own family called me a liability." Daniel's hand tightened on his mug. "I left with what I could carry. The rest I'm still carrying here." She tapped her chest once, not with drama but resignation. There was a long silence. Then Daniel said quietly, "You didn't just run. You saved them." Her lips parted, startled. "You put your body between them and whatever was coming. That's not cowardice, Ava." He rarely said her name. She looked down. "Some days I think I'll never stop running. That even in sleep, I'm still packing bags." Daniel leaned forward, elbows on knees, voice low. "Then stay here long enough to forget where you put them." She blinked. Once, then again, and suddenly her shoulders shook. No tears at first. Just that silent, trembling kind of cry. The kind that comes from trying too hard to be brave for too long. Daniel didn't move closer, but he stayed. Let her fall apart without asking her to explain it. The fire crackled. The wind moaned through the pines. Then she whispered, "No one's ever just let me come undone." He swallowed hard, voice rough. "Then maybe they didn't deserve the version of you that came after." She looked up, and for the first time, there was something between them that wasn't caution, wasn't survival. It was warmth. Later, after the cabin was quiet again and the fire had burned low, Daniel stood by the window. Snow clung thick to the glass. He could barely make out the trees beyond the porch, but he knew they were there, tall and still, their roots deep. He heard soft footsteps behind him. Ava stopped at the threshold, blanket around her shoulders, hair loose, not polished, not perfect, just real. "You said once," she said, "that you lost your wife." He nodded. 7 years ago this January, car accident." She hesitated. "How did you come back from that?" Daniel looked down at his hands. "Some days I didn't. Some days I still don't." A beat. "Then how did you let someone else in again?" He looked at her, really looked, and said quietly, "I haven't yet." She didn't move, didn't flinch, just met his gaze and nodded as if understanding something neither of them could say aloud yet. And in the silence between them, the fire burned just a little brighter. The thaw came slowly. Not in the weather. It was still deep winter, the kind that gnawed at window frames and painted frost along the edges of the glass. But inside the cabin, something had softened. The rhythm of things had begun to shift. Ava had started to hum while washing dishes. Lily now sat beside Jack during their homeschool lessons, and Caleb, still too small to speak, had begun toddling after Daniel like a curious duckling, arms always reaching. Daniel didn't speak of it, didn't point it out. didn't risk breaking the fragile spell. But one morning after splitting wood for the fire, he walked back to the porch and found Ava there, seated on the step, elbows on her knees, staring out at the trees. "You look like you're waiting on something," he said. She didn't smile. "I'm waiting for the silence to end." He sat down beside her, careful not to let his shoulder touch hers. "What kind of silence?" "The kind before everything changes." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I used to think silence meant safety. But sometimes it's just what fear wears when it wants to look polite." Ava turned her face slightly toward him. "You say things like that. And I don't know if you mean them, or if you're just trying to keep me from running." He met her eyes. "Both can be true." She looked away. "Maybe I shouldn't have stayed this long." The words landed hard, not because they were unexpected, but because they were real. Daniel didn't move. "You thinking about leaving?" "I'm thinking about not becoming dependent on something that was never meant to last." She stood, arms crossed tight. "This place, this peace, you." There it was. The line, drawn not in anger, but in fear. He stood slowly, brushed the snow off his jeans. "This peace you keep talking about," he said, voice low, steady. "Wasn't here before you." Ava blinked. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Daniel took a step closer. "You think this place is some temporary pause between disasters? I get it. You've lived in war zones made of boardrooms and press junkets and glass towers with knives behind every handshake." Her jaw clenched. "But you're wrong if you think this doesn't matter, that what's happening here isn't real just because it doesn't fit into the life you planned." Her breath hitched. "Just once. You showed up on my doorstep in the middle of a snowstorm, holding 2 kids like they were the only pieces of you still worth saving. And I opened the door because something in me, something I thought was long gone, knew better." He paused. The cold bit at his throat, but he didn't flinch. "I didn't save you, Ava. You walked in. You chose to stay. But if you walk away now..." His voice broke slightly, only for a second. "I'll pretend I never lit that fire. I'll pretend you and Lily and Caleb were just passing through." He met her eyes, steady and raw. "But it'll still break me." That's when it happened. Not loudly. Not like in the movies. But in the quietest way possible. Her shoulders dropped, her arms uncrossed, her breath caught in her chest, and for a heartbeat her entire body stilled, like a bird deciding whether to fly or fold into the wind. And then she cried. No gasping, no sobs. Just silent tears slipping down her cheeks, like they'd been waiting at the edge for years, finally given permission to fall. Daniel didn't reach for her, but he stayed, and she didn't run. That night, she didn't sit by the window. She sat on the floor beside the fire, Lily curled against her lap, Caleb sleeping in the quilt Daniel's wife had once made, back when the house still smelled like bread and baby lotion and hope. They didn't talk much. Daniel read aloud from an old book, his voice low, steady, the kind of sound that filled cracks without trying to mend them, and Ava watched him like she was memorizing something she knew she might forget, if she let herself. After the kids had gone to bed and the last candle had burned low, she found him by the sink drying mugs with one of the frayed dish towels. "I thought I couldn't cry anymore," she said, voice soft as steam. He didn't turn, just kept drying. "Turns out," she added, "I just hadn't heard the right words." Daniel looked at her then, slow and quiet. "Words don't save people. People do. I'm not used to either. You will be." She took a step forward. "You asked me once if I was thinking of leaving." He nodded. "I still don't know if I belong here," she said. "But I know this is the first time in years I've wanted to." Daniel leaned against the counter. The flicker of firelight danced in her eyes. "It's not about staying forever," he said. "It's about staying long enough to matter." She held his gaze, and for the first time since that night in the woods she smiled. Not the tight-lipped, calculated kind she wore in interviews or press conferences, but something slower, softer, something real. Later, as he stood by the doorway of the kids' room, watching Caleb sleep with one hand curled beneath his cheek and Lily breathing softly beside him, Daniel felt something move in his chest. Not pain, not fear, just the quiet recognition that something was changing. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop being afraid of it. Daniel had never seen his cabin look like this. There were wet mittens drying on the railing, a pair of pink boots by the door that didn't belong to Jack, and 2 plastic cups with crayon drawings stuck to the refrigerator with chipped magnets. None of it had been planned, but somehow all of it belonged now. He watched as Ava stood barefoot, in the kitchen stirring something on the stove. She wore one of his flannel shirts over a plain white tee, sleeves rolled to the elbows, her hair pulled into a loose braid that kept falling over her shoulder. She didn't ask before she started cooking, didn't ask to rearrange the spice rack or hum quietly to herself as she cleaned the cast iron pan. But Daniel couldn't remember the last time the cabin had smelled this warm, or the last time someone had hummed in it. Jack and Lily sat cross-legged on the rug, building something out of wooden blocks. Caleb was toddling from chair to chair, proud of his every step, as if he had invented walking himself. Daniel leaned in the doorway, mug in hand, and just watched. Not the way a man watches a stranger, but the way a man watches something he thought he'd lost forever return. After dinner, they bundled up in coats and scarves and trudged out to the small shed behind the cabin. The roof had started to sag from years of neglect, but the frame still held strong. Daniel hadn't used it much since Claire passed, hadn't had the energy to fix what didn't seem worth saving. But tonight, it felt different. They spent the next hour sorting through old tools and bent nails, repurposing scraps of wood, and trimming back overgrown brambles that had crept along the base like slow-growing regrets. Ava worked beside him without complaint, even when her gloves tore and snow slipped down the back of her collar. She didn't flinch. She just smiled, a real one, and wiped her cheek with the back of her sleeve. "Do you always rebuild in the middle of winter?" she asked, cheeks flushed, breath fogging the air. Daniel smirked. "You never know when spring might come early." She paused, eyes meeting his. "Maybe it already has." That night, as the kids slept curled in their makeshift nest by the fire, Ava helped him hang a new curtain in the corner of the cabin, partitioning off a space that had long been empty. It was nothing fancy, just a soft gray sheet strung across a rope, but it gave her a corner to call her own. Daniel hung a small lamp from a nail beside it. When he switched it on, the fabric glowed gold like morning sun. Ava stood there quietly, one hand resting on the top of Caleb's tiny pack-and-play. "This isn't mine," she said softly. "But it doesn't feel borrowed either." Daniel's voice was low. "Some places aren't meant to be claimed, just lived in." She looked at him. "Is that what this is?" He shrugged. "A little life, in the middle of nowhere." Over the next week, time stopped moving the way it usually did. They baked bread. The first loaf burned slightly and the second turned out perfect. Ava taught Lily how to sew a crooked patch on Jack's ripped jeans. Daniel built a bird feeder, and Caleb knocked it over 3 times before they managed to hang it high enough. There were no declarations, no grand moments, just warmth. One evening, after the snow had paused and the pines stood hushed under their white coats, Daniel found Jack on the porch with Lily beside him, both bundled in oversized scarves. "She says she doesn't remember her old house," Jack said, looking out at the trees. Daniel sat beside them. "That okay with you?" Lily hesitated, then nodded. "This one's warmer." Daniel swallowed hard. He reached over and tousled her curls gently. "It's yours for as long as you need it." She smiled, the small kind that children give when they don't know how to say thank you. Later that night, after the fire had died down and the kids had gone to sleep, Ava stepped outside. Daniel followed. They stood on the porch, shoulder to shoulder, staring at the sky. Stars blinked between the branches like secrets. Somewhere deep in the woods, an owl called out low and lonesome. I used to think peace was silence, Ava said. And now, she exhaled. Now I think it's the absence of fear. Daniel looked at her. The way the snowlight traced the edge of her face, the faint line between her brows softening. You're safe here. I know, she turned to him. So are you. He didn't answer, didn't need to, because something in her words settled inside him, like a match against dry pine, and for the first time in years he let it catch, not into flames, but into warmth. That night, Daniel woke to the sound of soft humming. He walked quietly toward the source, stopping just outside the curtain Ava had drawn around her corner of the room. The lamp was on, glowing gently, and Ava was sitting on the edge of her bed, Caleb in her arms, rocking slowly. She was humming to him, a lullaby in a language Daniel didn't know. Her voice was barely above a whisper, tired, yes, but steady. And as he turned away, retreating silently into the dark, he realized this wasn't her home, but it was no longer just his either. It started with the dog barking. Not a sharp warning, but that low, guttural growl Daniel hadn't heard in years, since the night a black bear wandered too close to the shed. But this wasn't a bear. The forest was too quiet, the cold too deep. Whatever it was, it moved with intention. Daniel stepped outside, shotgun in hand, not loaded, not yet. He wasn't a man who spooked easy, but something about the air that morning made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. It had snowed during the night. A clean, untouched layer blanketed the yard, thick enough to soften all sound, except for the tracks. Boot prints. Just one set, coming in from the eastern pines, large, heavy, not there yesterday, and not made by anyone from this house. Daniel followed them to the edge of the clearing. They didn't stop, didn't circle, just came close enough to peer through windows, and turned back. He didn't follow them further. Not yet. Instead, he walked inside, carefully shutting the door behind him, heart pounding with a steadiness that had nothing to do with panic, and everything to do with the old, familiar sense of danger. Ava was in the kitchen. She froze when she saw his face. What is it? Boot prints, he said simply. Her body stiffened. His. Daniel didn't ask who. He didn't need to. By midday, Ava had packed the children's bags. She didn't say anything, just moved through the cabin with that old haunted focus, tucking socks into pockets, bottles into pouches, as if she'd done this before, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. Daniel watched for a while. Then, finally, he stepped between her and the door. Running won't keep them safe anymore, he said. Not forever. Ava looked up. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. Then you tell me what will. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have one yet. But he did know this. He was close, Ava. Close enough to watch. Close enough not to care we knew. She sat down slowly, holding her hands to her chest like something inside her might crack. It's been 5 months. I thought maybe the story had cooled. Daniel sat across from her. A man like that doesn't chase headlines. He chases power. And you took that away from him. Ava's jaw clenched. Then he won't stop. No, Daniel said. He won't. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the snow fall in gentle silence. He'd fixed the fire so it wouldn't crack too loud and let the dog rest near the door. The shotgun this time was loaded. Around 2 a.m., Ava came to sit beside him. She didn't speak. She just looked out the window, pulled her knees to her chest, and stared into the dark. After a long silence, she whispered, "When I left, I thought disappearing would be enough. That if I gave up the money, the name, the spotlight, he'd let us go." Daniel didn't look at her. Men like him don't care what you give, they only care what you take back. Ava swallowed hard. What if I can't protect them? Daniel finally turned. Then I will. Her eyes glistened. Even if it costs you everything? He didn't hesitate. Yes. The next morning the tracks were back, deeper, closer, circling the house. Daniel didn't tell Ava. She knew. She didn't need words to feel the air change. But what neither of them knew, what broke Daniel's quiet center, was when Jack came running in from feeding the chickens, breath short, eyes wide. There was a man, he said, in the trees, watching. Ava went pale. Daniel knelt in front of Jack, voice firm but calm. "Did he talk to you?" Jack shook his head. He smiled. They called the sheriff. In a town this small, it meant calling Caleb Morris, a man Daniel had known since high school. Caleb arrived before noon, dusted the tracks with quiet care, asked Ava a few questions he didn't write down. "He's not local," Caleb said finally. "That much is clear. But if he wants something, he's not just watching." Ava's voice was like glass. "He wants to scare me." Daniel stood beside her. He succeeded. Caleb looked at them both. "Do you want protection?" "No," Ava said. "I want it to end." Daniel felt something shift beside him then. A decision being made, not out of impulse, but out of exhaustion and courage. That night, Ava wrote a letter. Daniel didn't read it, but he saw her place it in the wooden box beside the fire, the one where she kept her letters to the children. She lingered a moment, fingers resting on the lid. Then, she turned to him. "If he comes for them, you don't ask questions. You take them and run, understand?" Daniel stepped closer, his voice rough. "You're not dying on this hill alone, Ava." "I'm not dying," she said, eyes sharp. "I'm fighting." Nodded. "Then I'm standing with you." They fortified the doors, locked the windows, slept in shifts. Daniel didn't pray often, but that night, he did. Not for safety, but for the strength to do what love demanded, even if it meant standing between a monster and the woman who had started to make his house feel like home again. The knock came just before dusk. Not loud, not rushed, just deliberate. Daniel was at the sink, rinsing a pan when the sound hit. The hair on his arms rose before the rest of him registered the change. He turned slowly, set the pan down, dried his hands on his shirt. Outside, snow was falling. Again, soft flakes dancing against a slate sky. But the knock had nothing soft about it. Ava froze. She'd been reading with Lily on the rug. Caleb stirred in the crib. One look between them was enough. Daniel stepped to the door, motioned Ava back with a gentle hand. He grabbed the shotgun, still, unloaded but visible, and opened the door. The man on the porch didn't flinch. Tall, clean-cut, wearing a long wool coat that hadn't known dirt in years. His smile was practiced, polished, and Daniel hated him instantly. "Evening," the man said. "Lovely place you've got here." Daniel didn't respond. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. The man glanced at the shotgun. "That for me?" Daniel's voice was flat. "Depends on what you want." He chuckled. "Relax, I'm just here to collect what's mine." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You don't own anyone here." The man's eyes narrowed, just slightly. "She's not who you think she is, you know. Ava Lancaster may look like a damsel, but she's a master at manipulation. She's good at playing the victim." Daniel didn't move. "She took my son," the man added, "and my daughter, and now she's hiding behind a small-town fantasy like it changes anything." Daniel's voice, when it came, was low and razor-steady. "You didn't lose them. You drove them away." The man's smile vanished. Daniel stepped closer. "You ever lift a hand to her again and I'll bury you in snow so deep God himself won't find you before spring." The man tilted his head. "You'd go that far for a woman you barely know?" Daniel didn't blink. "No," he said. "For the family I chose." He didn't raise the gun, didn't need to. The man knew. He saw it now. In Daniel's stance, his eyes. The iron stillness of someone who had already decided what he'd die for, and what he'd kill for. The stranger's lips twitched. "You'll regret this." Daniel took one last step forward, close, enough to smell his cologne. "I regret letting her open that door," he whispered. "You should have stayed in the city." The man backed away, slow, deliberate, not afraid, but unsure for the first time, and then he turned, walked back into the trees, vanished. Daniel stayed outside for a long while after, watching the woods. Only when he was certain did he go back in. Ava stood just behind the curtain, her body taut, her hands white-knuckled at her sides. "He's gone," Daniel said. Her eyes shimmered. "You didn't have to." "Yes," he cut in softly. "I did." She stepped forward slowly, like a person learning how to trust the floor beneath her feet. Then, for the first time, she reached for him, not out of fear, out of choice. And Daniel, scarred, cautious, rebuilt in silence, opened his arms without hesitation. She pressed her forehead against his chest, breath shaking, and whispered, "No one's ever stood between me and him." His hand slid gently over her back. "Then it's about time someone did." That night the cabin was quiet. The kids, though restless, finally fell asleep with Ava, curled beside them. Daniel sat near the fire, one hand over his chest, feeling the pulse of something he hadn't let himself name. It wasn't just fear. It was purpose. He had lived so long inside a stillness born of grief. A man hollowed out by loss. But now, something had filled the space again. Something louder than silence, deeper than pain. A promise. Just after midnight, Ava joined him again by the fire. She looked different now. Not stronger. She'd always been strong, but no longer folded inward. She moved with the quiet gravity of a woman who knew she could break and had decided not to. "I didn't think he'd come this far," she said. Daniel didn't look away from the fire. "Because he didn't think you'd find anyone who'd stop him." She sat down beside him. "Why did you?" she asked. He turned to her, slowly, deliberately. "Because I thought I'd forgotten how to love," he said, voice barely more than breath. "And then you showed up, and I remembered what it feels like to care if someone walks out that door." Ava's eyes welled, but no tears fell. "I'm scared," she admitted. "He'll try again." "Let him," Daniel said. "We won't be alone when he does." She leaned into him, their shoulders touching now. No apology, no pulling back. "You mean that?" she asked. "I do." A long pause. Then she whispered, "If it cost you everything?" He looked at her then, really looked, and said the words that sealed something deeper than any vow. "If I have to pay again to protect you and those kids, I will, every time." In the stillness that followed, Ava buried her face in his chest and wept, not from fear, not from sorrow, but from the quiet miracle of finally being protected, not by money, not by bodyguards, but by someone who had nothing to prove and still chose to stand between her and the world. It started with smoke. Daniel woke first, before the crackle, before the alarms, before the panic, because his body had learned long ago that danger arrives quietly before it screams. He opened his eyes to a haze, thick and sharp and immediate. Smoke curled beneath the bedroom door, not just wood smoke, something darker, burning plastic, insulation. He moved fast, boots on, shirt grabbed, no time for coat. He flung the door open and shouted, voice hoarse, "Ava!" The house was glowing, red now, not with firelight, but with fire. Ava was already awake. Dragging Lily by the arm toward the front door, Caleb clutched to her chest. Her eyes met his through the swirling gray and widened with a fear Daniel had never seen before. Not even when her past had come to the doorstep. He ran for Jack. His son was coughing, eyes shut tight against the smoke. Daniel scooped him up, heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. Every creak of flame, every groan of the old beams overhead. It was all distant now. He barreled through the hall, smoke thick like river mud. They all met at the front. Door Daniel kicked it open. Cold air rushed in like mercy. They stumbled out into the snow, coughing, blinking, clutching one another. The cabin behind them flared, a breath of flame through the roof like a scream held too long. And then, silence. The kind that only comes after the worst has already begun. They watched it burn. All of it. The curtains Ava had sewn, the handmade bird feeder, the wooden box that held her letters. Letters Daniel had never read but somehow memorized by heart. It burned. Daniel didn't cry. He didn't have time to. He only stood, holding Jack close, watching the place that had once held his grief, now hold his hope and then lose it to the fire. Ava collapsed to her knees in the snow. She wasn't sobbing. She wasn't even breathing right. Daniel dropped beside her, pulling her against him. Caleb wailed against her shoulder. Lily just stood, fists clenched at her sides, eyes wide, unmoving. "We're alive," he said, over and over. "We're alive. You hear me? You got them out. You saved them." But Ava didn't speak, because she hadn't just lost shelter. She'd lost the one place she'd almost believed she could start over. The fire department came later, too late to save the house, but early enough to stop it from swallowing the woods. Sheriff Caleb Morris stood beside Daniel as the flames finally settled into ash and hiss. "We think it was deliberate," he said quietly. Daniel didn't look at him. "I know. You got an idea who?" Daniel said nothing, but he saw the man's face in his mind, the polished threat, the smile too clean, the way he'd said, "You'll regret this." He already did, but not for the reason the man had hoped. By morning, only the chimney remained. Blacktooth in the white snow. The rest had collapsed into memory and cinders. Daniel found Ava sitting on the back porch steps, what was left of them, wrapped in a blanket someone from town had brought. Her eyes were red but dry. He sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. Neither of them spoke. Then she said quietly, "I didn't keep the letters. I meant to take them, but I froze." Daniel looked at her. "They were everything I hadn't said," she whispered. "To the kids, to you, to myself." He reached down, picked up a charred fragment from the snow, a corner of paper, the curve of one letter, maybe a C, maybe a D. "Words burn," he said, "but the people who wrote them don't." She turned to him slowly. "What if I don't know how to start again?" Daniel stared at the ash, the bones of a home. "You just did," he said. That night they stayed in the neighbor's spare room. Jack slept beside Lily on a pull-out couch. Caleb curled against Ava. Daniel sat by the window, watching the sky for storms that wouldn't come, tracing the edge of the night with his thoughts. Everything was gone, but not everyone. And that, somehow, was enough. For now. In the morning, someone knocked. Not Danger this time, just Mrs. Weller from the bakery. She held out a box. "Fresh bread and some jam. I figured you might need something warm." Behind her, others stood in the snow. Sheriff Morris, Tobias the carpenter, teenagers from the school with arms full of blankets and supplies. No one spoke of rebuilding. They just started. Because in towns like this, when one house falls, every neighbor feels the wind. Ava stepped onto the porch and saw them. Her hand reached. Instinctively for Daniel's, he took it, squeezed. She looked at him, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, hair pulled back in a shaky knot. "I didn't think I had anything left," she whispered. Daniel leaned close, his voice hoarse but steady. "You still have you. And you've got us." She turned back to the snow where strangers shoveled ash, sorted beams, stacked bricks, and for the first time since the fire her lips parted, not in pain, but in awe, because loss had come like a thief. But kindness had come like a flood. It began with a hammer. Not Daniel's, Tobias Knox. The old carpenter showed up just after sunrise the next day, carrying a coffee can full of bent nails and a quiet kind of determination Daniel hadn't seen since his wife's funeral. "You're gonna need a new beam here," he said, pointing to the charred outline of the porch. "And probably 6 sets of hands to raise it." Daniel stood in the snow, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, wearing the same coat he'd thrown on during the fire. He wasn't sure he could speak yet. Tobias didn't wait for permission. He just set down the can, pulled out a measuring tape, and got to work. By mid-morning, they weren't alone. Sheriff Morris brought lumber from an old project that never made it past planning. Ava watched from the kitchen window of the borrowed house, eyes flickering with disbelief as high schoolers, kids she didn't even know, dragged planks across the snow like they were hauling treasure. And then, Mrs. Weller arrived, not with bread this time, with blueprints. "They're from my late husband," she said, laying them out on the table like scripture. He always wanted to design a house with more windows and a reading nook. Ava stared down at the page, fingertips brushing the penciled curves. "We can't repay this." Mrs. Weller's eyes twinkled. "Honey, you don't repay kindness. You pass it forward." The rebuild didn't happen all at once. There were miscuts and splinters, snow that turned tools to iron, a nail through someone's boot. But each day brought more hands, more laughter, more coffee passed around in mismatched thermoses. Jack helped carry shingles. Lily painted the first window frame yellow. Caleb made everyone laugh by trying to eat sawdust. Ava baked for the first time in years, her hands covered in flour and something close to joy. And Daniel, he built. He built like a man stitching something back into himself. Not just beams and walls, but pieces of the life he'd stopped believing in. His hands ached, his back burned. But when he stood each night under the half-raised roof, he felt taller than he had in years. One afternoon, Daniel found Ava out by the edge of the clearing, staring at the burned remains of the old chimney. She held something in her hands, a piece of scorched metal warped and blackened. "The latch from the old stove," she said. Daniel stepped beside her. "I thought we should bury it," she whispered. "Not hide it, but let it rest." So they did. Together. They dug into the snow-packed ground and laid the piece down like a memory. Then beside it, they planted something new, a small sapling Tobias had brought from his own land. A promise tree, the old man had called it. "It'll grow if you do." Ava knelt beside it, her fingers brushing snow from its branches. Daniel stood behind her, and in that still moment, he didn't see the fire anymore. He saw the future. The cabin took shape slowly, room by room, nail by nail, but by the end of the month it stood proud, modest, warm, made not of wealth but of hands, hearts, and something stronger than both: belonging. The final touch was the fireplace. Daniel had saved a single brick from the ruins, one with a corner chipped from where Jack used to rest his toy trucks. He placed it in the center, built the hearth around it. When the first fire flickered back to life in that new space, Ava stood in the doorway holding Caleb, her eyes reflecting both the flames and the long road behind them. "Do you think we'll always remember what it cost?" she asked. Daniel met her gaze. "We have to." She nodded, then stepped inside. On the day they moved back in, the town came again. Not with tools, with food, flowers, a set of mismatched mugs, a book of poems, a tiny quilt Lily had sewn by hand, with the help of the church ladies. No speeches, no celebration, just warmth. Real, human, quiet warmth. Ava stood on the porch, the sapling now budding behind her, and whispered to Daniel, "I think I finally understand what home is." He didn't speak. He just reached for her hand, the same way he had that night after the fire. This time she laced her fingers through his, and didn't let go. That evening, after the house had settled, the kids asleep and the town gone quiet under a fresh coat of snow, Daniel sat by the new hearth. The wooden box of letters had been replaced. Ava had built it herself. She opened it now gently and placed a folded page inside. Then she looked at him. "It's a letter to the house," she said, half smiling. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What does it say?" Ava hesitated, then whispered, "Thank you for letting me come back, even when I didn't believe I could." Daniel swallowed hard. "You think the house will write back?" he asked. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "It already has." Spring came slowly that year. The snow didn't melt in a rush. It lingered, reluctant to leave the trees, the eaves, the quiet places. But the sun started rising earlier. The wind softened. And one morning, Daniel stepped onto the porch and heard something he hadn't heard in months. Water trickling. The thaw had begun, and beneath the old pines, reborn from ash and winter, stood the miracle he never thought he'd see again. Family. Inside the cabin, life moved like breath. Caleb was trying to crawl faster than his legs allowed, determined to conquer every rug and floorboard. Lily had taken over the breakfast table with crayons, maps, and secret treasure plans. Jack read to them both with the self-importance of an older brother, occasionally stopping to explain big words no one had asked about. Ava moved through the house barefoot, cup of tea in hand, wearing one of Daniel's flannel shirts like it. Belonged to her, which in every way that mattered, it did. Daniel stood in the doorway and just watched, not with disbelief anymore, but with something steadier, something like peace. Later that afternoon, they walked to the edge of the woods where the sapling had been planted. The promise tree, Lily had started calling it. It had grown, not much, but enough to show it had survived. Tiny green shoots had begun to peek from its branches, defying the lingering chill in the air. Ava knelt beside it, her fingers tracing the curve of new life. "It's strong," she whispered, "even after the fire." Daniel watched her, remembering the woman who'd arrived here with snow in her hair and smoke in her eyes. "I think it always was," he said. She stood and turned to him, brushing dirt from her knees. "Do you ever think," she asked, "about what might have happened if you hadn't opened the door that night?" "All the time," he replied. "And," he took her hand gently, "I think it saved me just as much as it saved you." That night they ate dinner by the fire, not because the power was out, not because they had no choice, but because the fire had become their way of remembering where they'd started, what they'd rebuilt, and the warmth they'd chosen to share. Caleb fell asleep in Ava's arms before dessert. Lily leaned against Daniel's side, humming a song she swore she'd written herself. Jack played quietly on the rug, his shoulders finally relaxed in a way Daniel hadn't seen since Claire passed. When the kids were finally in bed, Ava sat beside him on the couch, legs tucked beneath her. He reached into the new letterbox, pulled out a folded page and handed it to her. She raised an eyebrow. "You wrote one?" He nodded. "Want me to read it aloud?" "Please." She opened it carefully. Her voice, though quiet, filled the room. "Dear whoever finds this, this isn't a story about a man who saved someone, or a woman who ran, or a house that burned. It's about what survived. It's about what we choose when no one's watching. I once thought grief was the last chapter of love, but I was wrong. Sometimes love begins in the ashes, and sometimes, miraculously, it stays." When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. She set the letter down and reached for his hand. "I can't promise forever," she whispered. "I know." He turned toward her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But," she added, voice trembling, "I can choose you, every day." He smiled, soft and full. "That's all I want." The next morning, Lily taped a new picture to the refrigerator. 4 stick figures stood beneath a tree with bright green leaves and roots drawn like hands. Above them, in childlike scrawl, were 3 simple words. "We stayed here." And they did, through storms, through laughter, through the ordinary. Not because they had to, but because somewhere beneath the pines, in a cabin born from kindness, a man who had once shut his door to the world had opened it again. And this time, he never closed it. Maybe it wasn't about grand endings. Maybe it was just about showing up, staying and choosing each other day after day. If this story warmed something quiet in you, hit like and subscribe to our channel, because some stories aren't just told, they're remembered together.